how about we get started? Thank you guys for coming back. Those who weren't able to make the first session, it was wonderful. I'm going to let Sandra introduce our next speaker.
We are blessed to have Reverend Norwood join us again this year. Back in 2016, he was able to come over to Camp Occonequan and talk to us, which has been recorded, and it's a beautiful, approximately 40-minute podcast. So this repeat time together, not the actual words, but our time together is cherished. Thank you. Friends, pastor is not only of Nanticoke-Lenape Tribal Nation, Supreme Justice there, seated with the National Congress of American Indians. He is minister of a church in Ewing, New Jersey. But beyond that, please hear the words. He is our friend. He is our mentor. He is our loved one. He and his communities are of us too. He is a father. He is a grandfather. He is a husband. And so I ask you to open your hearts to one of my fondest, dearest friends, Pastor John Norwood. Love you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandra. It's always a pleasure seeing you and Jim, even though we haven't been able to be together for almost 2 years now, it seems, but I'm assuming eventually we'll be able to have that blessing. Hello, friends, and it's a wonder being able to visit with you again, even though we're not sitting in the woods by a lakeside like we did back in 2016. I guess we can imagine the lakeside if you want to. It's an honor to be able to speak to the Tricorder meeting. I want to thank Joshua for his hospitality and helping me do the technical check and receiving me. And I say Wanishi to all of you, and Wanishi also, Sandra, for the gifts. And certainly they will be put to good use. I'm going to share my screen now, and I've put together a little presentation, and following which I'm assuming we can spend some time chatting about it and answering any questions that you may have. So this is, I'm calling this Continuing the Legacy of Shackamaxon, which is the place where the treaty between Penn and the Lenape chiefs represented by Tamanin took place over in Philadelphia. It's called Penn Treaty Park today. We have the Benjamin West and the Edward Hicks paintings that depicted that event, along with the crest of my nation, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape. Indeed, as whenever we meet together, the Quakers and the Lenape people meet together, I always see it as a continuation of the intentions of that meeting and the keeping of the promise of Tamanin that we would live together in peace as long as the creeks and rivers run and while the sun, moon, and stars endure. So the Pawtucket region is the region of what is now called the Delaware Bay. The bay in Lenape, Lenape language is Pawtucket. It means the round water. And even though it's not perfectly round, it was a reference to the bay itself. When the Brits came, we were referred to as the Bay Indians, and there are 3 continuing tribes around the bay, and that would include my own tribe, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape, also the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware, which is situated in Cheswold, just outside of Dover, Delaware, and the Nanticoke Indian tribe of Delaware, which is down along the Indian River. These communities have continued from historic times and have intermarried for several hundred years. The ancient roots of my people include both the Nanticoke and the Lenape. The Lenape, or the original people or ancient ones, the territory extended from the headwaters of the Hudson and all the way down the Delaware into the bay. It included southwestern Connecticut, southeastern New York, all of New Jersey, which we call Shackamaxon, and also the eastern Pennsylvania and northern Delaware down to Cape Henlopen. My ancestors were known as diplomats and peacekeepers. The Nanticoke were one of the tribes that came out of the Lenape. There were many in the Northeast that came from the Lenape, which included the tribes that speak the Algonquian language dialect, view the Lenape as their ancient ones. The Nanticoke are among them and remain very close in relationship and intermarried with the Lenape grandfathers for many generations. The territories touched each other, and the Nanticoke, by the time that colonization had taken place, the Nanticoke were already the dominant tribe in the central part of the Delmarva and were known as bridge builders and excellent traders. We can trace the doctrine of discovery that impacted the way colonization took place back to papal bulls, going all the way back to the 15th century. And essentially, it set up the way contact and the continuing relationship would flow. And sadly, it had a backdrop of conquest, where it wasn't merely coming to settle among us, but eventually it turned to a feeling of conquering us and being able to claim the land we lived on and the way we could live on that land. The words from the bull Romanus Pontifex was capture, vanquish, subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, put them into perpetual slavery, take all their possessions and property. With this as a backdrop that continued to influence the way that the colonies grew here on Turtle Island, North America, it kind of showed how things would develop over time, and sadly, how they wound up developing over time. 90% of our tribes died. The population of our tribes died during first contact, either by disease or war. And due to the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, we continued to lose our rights and continued to be oppressed in how we wanted to live in the way that we used to live. Occupying our territory no longer was it viewed as our territory. The early transmission of lands was viewed as a transmission of ownership with the early land grants that happened in our area around the Delaware Bay, whereas for our people, they were allowing people to live with us. From a European perspective, they were making a purchase that put an end to our rights on the land. And that caused a lot of tension between our people and the new immigrants. Just dealing with the history of the Nanticoke-Lenape people, we see that by the end of the 17th century, the reservations that had been set aside for us were being disbanded because there was pressure for the early colonists to be able to acquire the land that had been set aside for our people to be able to live in peace and in their ancient way. Many wound up being forced to migrate, wound up as far out as Oklahoma and Wisconsin and up into Canada. There are communities that are still there today. Those that remained, we were forced to adapt to Anglo-American lifeways, and while we still lived in our communities. However, we were being reclassified, and it was a form of administrative genocide that was taking place. Beginning in 1740, if you were a Christian who ate primarily chicken or pork, even if you were Nanticoke and Lenape, you were no longer considered Indian, because the official definition of Indian, according to the colonial law, was a non-Christian living in the woods and eating primarily deer meat. By 1770, the Delaware legislator referred to Indians only as those living far away from the state of Delaware. This was a way of eradicating Indian identity between the state of Delaware, and it influenced states around it. We know that this happened in Virginia, and we also know that it happened here in New Jersey. Those of us who remain wound up being reclassified as free persons of color, mulatto, instead of Indian. I have an ancestor who was born Indian When he became a Christian, he was called a free person of color. And when he married a woman that was Black and Indian, he was reclassified as mulatto. The historic tribes that continue in New Jersey and Delaware, five of which are recognized by their respective states. The Ramapo-Lenape Nation in the north, bordering up on the New York border, the Powhatan-Lenape Nation in the central part of the state, which are Virginia Indians that came and intermarried with remaining Lenape in the 1800s. The Nanticoke-Lenape Tribal Nation are the three state recognized tribes here in New Jersey. The tribes in New Jersey also recognize the Sand Hill Indians as a legitimate historic community. Then there are two tribes that are recognized by the state of Delaware, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian Tribe in Delaware. The definition of a tribe is important for people to understand because so many today, especially with the advent of Ancestry.com, people have found some small percentage of Indian ancestry. They seek out others that also have some percentage of Indian ancestry, and some are coalescing and deciding that they're going to be called a tribe. And while they can be a cultural group, cultural enthusiast group, historical society, tribes are ancient. To actually claim the designation of tribe or band or nation, you have to be historic. Your community needs to be continuous from historic times, at least prior to 1900, but preferably going much further back. It needs to be interrelated. The families have continued among one another and have intermarried with one another, and you've been self-governing through that entire time period. Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape are a well-documented continuous community of interrelated Nanticoke and Lenape families. Our ancestors lived on reservations and designated Indian towns and Indian fields throughout the colonial and early federal periods. They're documented to have been in those locations. Our tribal ancestors are identified on muster rolls during the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, in Seaman's papers during the conflict with Great Britain in the War of 1812, during the Civil War, and in census records. Government records, news articles, anthropological, ethnological studies going back to the 1800s through to the modern era specifically identify our tribal families and our community activities and institutions. And there are family members who attended Indian boarding schools. And at a time when you had to have a percentage of Indian blood to be eligible to attend such schools. We've maintained community and governance throughout the time period in different forms, but certainly continuing as tribal families living together and governing our community. And each of the three communities around the Delaware Bay established tribal churches and tribal schools, and eventually reorganized tribal governments with elected tribal chiefs and councils. The Nanticoke Lenape and the Lenape Indian tribe in Delaware have also maintained a relationship with the nation of Sweden that had its New Sweden colony in our territory. And this is a photograph of our chief shaking the king's hand when they came to visit. The royal family has visited us on several occasions, and we actually opened their embassy in Washington, D.C. As you know, the relationship with the Quakers dates back to the 1600s. And while many people focus on William Penn and the Penn Treaty, actually, prior to that, we had a relationship with the friends here in New Jersey, both with the Burlington meeting and also down in Salem. And Fenwick established his colony within our territory and established treaties with our people going back into the 1670s. The Salem meeting house is still standing, and what was there until a few years ago was the Salem oak tree, which was a treaty oak where treaties were cut with the Quaker community there. And it fell maybe a year or two prior to the pandemic. It seems like time is, it's difficult to figure out exactly when things happened right now, but just a year or two prior to the pandemic, that tree, which was quite a few hundred years old, fell. in a storm. In dealing with our spiritual practices, it's very important to understand that while we have continued many of the practices, some have changed in form, and some have come to us from other native cultures, in addition to the fact that our tribe has, through the last 300 years of history, been primarily Christian. It's important to note that not all tribes or individual American Indians have identical beliefs. People say American Indians believe, and that's a big problem, because American Indians believe many different things, not only as individuals, but even tribally, regionally, based on where you came up in the country. And while there are a lot of common values and principles that are shared, even the way they are expressed can be different. So there are a lot of misconceptions that take place because people make presumptions that we all share the same history, the same culture, when actually there are many different histories and different cultures here in North America among the different tribes. To say that all American Indians believe this and all American Indians have had, this particular event in their history would be like me saying all Europeans, believe this and all Europeans do this, and that's not necessarily the case. People mix and match different American Indian cultures, and it would be viewed as inappropriate to do so if it were mixing and matching different European cultures and claiming that there was one culture in Europe when there are not. Commonly held values that are evident among most American indigenous peoples is that the creator owns the creation, that all that he created has value, and all that the creator created belongs to the creator. The land, the water, everything that lives in it, that we have to interact with nature and with others in a good way. And that means living with humility and kindness and generosity and hospitality. And all of these things have a spiritual impact. We have to have respect for the past and the future, honoring the ways that have been passed down to us, and have a responsibility to pass those ways on. There's a tradition that we look back 7 generations to what has been given, and we have to anticipate and plan to leave a legacy for the next 7 generations. We are part of nature and not separated from it. It's not us against nature, it's us as part of the natural world around us. And there's a sacred connection. And even the thought that the land itself is living and worthy of respect. And as we care for the environment, it in turn cares for us. There are many different types of ceremonies that are practiced based on the culture you come from, the indigenous culture you come from. However, what I have found is that all of the cultures share ceremonies that strengthen the relationship with one another, relationship with our ancestors, relationship with nature, and this is all in celebration of the creator. Among the Nanticoke-Lenape, some distinctions are that our people were always monotheistic. We believed in lesser spiritual forces, which we called Manitou-Wak, Manitou meaning spirit, Wak being the plural. However, we never thought that they were worthy of worship, although we would provide respect and honor them just like we would honor chiefs or elders or what have you. And that the lesser spirits all served the creator, that the creator lived 12 spiritual levels above where the Lenape people lived. And each of these levels was given control by the creator, the control was delegated to one of the Manitou-Wak. There was always a belief in a soul and an afterlife, and even a belief in the presence of ancestors, not necessarily that their actual spirits were still here among us, because there was the belief that they traveled to the creator, but rather that there was a type of spiritual echo that continued to abide with us, that connected us to them. There are many references to God in the Lenape language. There is no equivalent as a proper name, but our names are descriptive. They could also be viewed kind of like titles. The one that is the most common, that is used most commonly when it is called in ceremonies, is Kishalimokonk, which means he who created us by his thoughts. And that's when we're speaking of him, when we're speaking to God. It's Kishalimyink, which means you who create us by your thought. There's a constant feeling that God's continual thinking of us is what gives us existence. There are so many other names that are given. People think that all natives call God the Great Spirit, and in most cultures, there is some word for that. But the term Great Spirit obviously is not native. There are many different native words that make a reference to that. And for us, the spirit is the Manitou, and he is the great Manitou. But more than that, he is the one who is the greatest spirit, Ketanituit. He is the one that gives us life, that gives us breath, who receives our prayers. The Nanticoke Lenape, as I had mentioned, were Christianized. As far, we can trace some of the earliest evidences of Christian conversion back to the 1600s. And with chiefs that were using a Christian cross for a mark. One actually changed his name to Christian the Indian. And the Christian tradition and conversions were so prevalent that churches were established by our people in the early 1800s. And each of the tribal communities has a central church that served as the center of tribal governance for at least 100, 150 years prior to the reestablishment of an elected tribal and council outside of the congregations. The tribal churches are all acknowledged as such as Native American churches by the United Methodist Board of Global Ministries and by their respective states. At the top, you see a photograph of the Indian Mission Church. In the center, it is the Emmanuel Church, and at the bottom, it's the St. John's Church in New Jersey. Each of these congregations actually was part of, I guess I should say that the one listed at the top, the Indian Mission, and the one at the bottom, the St. John's, was a split from an earlier congregation, and there were demographic shifts that took the congregational majority people who were voting out of the hands of the native population. So the church, because it was the tribal government, in order to preserve that, there was a split that took place, and these churches continued. The St. John's Church in Fordville, just outside of the city of Bridgeton, New Jersey, has been in the news recently. There have been there's been vandalism there in the Indian graveyard and the Indian Veterans Memorial that was just dedicated recently. We solicit your prayers for that situation. Sacred ceremonies were a regular part of life and continue to be so among many of the people that practice the traditional ways. Within the tribal community, you have those that practice primarily the old traditions. You have those that practice primarily Christianity, and then you have those in the middle who do both and participate in some way in both ways. There were ceremonies and continue to be ceremonies for the seasons and planting and harvest and hunting and healing, marriage, rites of passage. And each ceremony had its own separate types of rituals and a different way of approaching, some including dancing and singing, some quiet, some incorporating fire and smudging and smoke, some having drums, some not using any particular instruments. So there are various ways of having these ceremonies, but they do continue today. One of the ceremonies that is very common among our people, that happens at least twice a year, is the naming ceremony. and our people come into a prayer circle, and individuals are given their tribal ceremonial names. And that happens twice a year. A major ceremony that is known for, is distinctive of the Lenape people, although there is some question as to how ancient it is as a separate ceremony, is the Gamwing, called the Big House ceremony. We had at least 12 different celebrations a year that were forms of Thanksgiving. There is some question as to whether the Gamwing became a coalescing of those 12 celebrations after the disruption of our territory and the breaking up of our people, and people starting to have to be pushed further and further west. So we're not exactly sure how old the Gamwing is in the form that it came into the last century. But it was an annual ceremony. It took place over many days. And the photograph, well, the drawing that you have depicts one of the last ones that took place, I believe that may have been in Kansas. I believe that was in Kansas for one of the communities that wound up in Oklahoma. But it incorporated a celebration of creation. It was a ceremony where you actually, the people from each of the clans would come together and would perform ceremony and dance and share visions, and would go through a ceremony that actually was intercession, prayerful intercession for the entire universe. For all of creation and all of the creatures of creation, all of the people on the planet, not just that community or that tribe, but all people everywhere, for the balance that was taken, that had to be maintained. And it was a thanksgiving to the Creator for maintaining it. The life path of people was kind of symbolized from the entryway to the exit of the Big House. And a very unique drum was played in the Big House. Matter of fact, it didn't even look much like a drum. It looked like a wrapped skin. The sticks that you see in the photograph, in the image, one with a male figure and the other with a female figure, were the ones that were used to beat the Big House drum. The mask is a missing mask, which was representative of the Manitou, the spirits. The particular missing that's dressed with the bearskin garment was a depiction of a particular spirit that was the guardian of the forest creatures and maintained the balance between the needs of the people to eat and hunt, and the need of the forest creatures to be allowed to survive and live, and maintain the balances and for that. The pump drill that you see on the right-hand side is a ceremonial drill, and that was actually used to make the ceremonial fire for the Big House. We have those that actually still use it today sometimes in the ceremonies that take place on our tribal grounds in South Jersey. Some of the practices that people are aware of and think of when they think of Native cultures are not as common among Native cultures as you may think. One is the peyote ritual, which has become common, stemming from the Southwest. It incorporates the use of hallucinogenics, but it's not observed among all tribes. It was not even anciently practiced among many of the tribes that practice it today. But it is a ritual that is ancient among the Indians of the Southwest. The Sundance ceremony is another one that has been popularized in movies and through the spread of the American Indian movement. And that comes to us from the Western tribes. And that is a ceremony that takes place over many days and involves piercing of your skin, the scars of which are seen as badges of honor. But that is, while that has become a practice of many individuals, it is not common among many tribes. The Nanticoke-Lenape never used peyote or hallucinogenics in that way for worship. And we were not a Sundance people, although there are individuals in our tribe that do Sundance today. One of the problems that we have among our spiritual practices and the way that we're perceived by the general public is that there is a sense that were somehow linked to New Age practices. And one of the things that I like to warn people of is that at least for Lenape tradition and for Nanticoke tradition, our spiritual practices are tied to tribal identity. While there are people that may be invited into to be among us because they have kind of been embraced by the tribe, we're not proselytizing in that way. There are some tribes that may do that, but that's not our way. And I always try to warn people of those who claim to be chiefs and medicine men and magic men and everything, and they mix what they claim to be traditional ways with New Age spirituality, which is not part of our tradition. Some of these individuals will ask for money. That is not part of our tradition. While it's certainly fine to give an honor gift, which may or may not be actual money, to charge for ceremonies is a no-no from our perspective. And typically ceremonies are not something that you advertise out to the public in regard to the Nanticoke-Lenape tradition. If it looks like it's New Age, it seems akin to Eastern mysticism or reminds you of some 1960s hippie culture, is just plain weird, it's probably not an authentic American Indian spiritual practice. Our relationship with the earth is due to the fact that we view ourselves as part of and not separate from nature itself. And in many of the traditions across North America, the reason that a common reference for the continent is Turtle Island is because of the common belief that the land itself is living, is on the back of a great turtle that the creator brought up from the earth. And there are a lot of different versions of the story, but it's a commonly held belief. And it reminds our people, the moral of it is that the earth is alive and that we have to respect it as a living thing, that nature has spiritual value and identity, and is because it belongs to the creator, it has to be respected as such. That everything has to be done in a purposeful, harmonious way because we are interconnected with all other things. If nature is hurt, we are hurt. There's a respect for all life, and sometimes you'll even hear a reference to animals as, peoples, for the four-legged people, the winged people, emphasizing the dignity of the creatures within nature, and that our respect for nature is part of our spiritual good walk on this earth in our lifetime. And one of the things that the Lenape always believed that they are responsible for, and this comes down into many of the modern practices and many of our people still hold to this, is that we have a responsibility to maintain certain natural balances, and that's done through living in a good way and through certain rituals. But it's important for everyone to understand that, just like I said, not all American Indians believe the same thing. Not all American Indians have an environmental consciousness. That's a stereotype that just because you have Native American blood, somehow you have some environmental consciousness. That's not necessarily the case. But many of the values do transfer from one generation to the next. But what you'll see is that the closer a person is tied to the traditions of a tribal community, the more those values will transfer into that person. Environmental injustice is part of the process of colonization. We see that because we lost control of our lands, because the lands were seen as merely something that could be exploited for profit, that harm was done to our homeland. Invasive species were introduced. A lot of the natural plants were impacted. Many died out, which were our natural medicines, which were a food source for some of the indigenous species. And many of these things have gone to near or actual extinction. And what we see is that through the constant removal or restricting of our people to areas that no one else wanted, which is an ancient form of what, redlining. Redlining today is where certain minorities aren't allowed in certain communities and are pushed to other communities in the real estate market. Well, that actually it goes all the way back to colonization, where, we were pushed into the areas nobody wanted anymore until they found some resource under the ground, and then they wanted it and they tried to take that too. But that created tension on our ability to continue to interact with the land, sometimes in strange areas that we weren't used to for those of our relatives that were pushed further and further west. So our relationship with the land is part of our tribal understanding of who we are. Part of our very identity and our sovereignty is tied to our interaction with our environment. Some of the lessons that we learned from the recent protests at Standing Rock by the water protectors is that we have many allies, and there were many non-native environmentalists that joined in, many who did so out of a sense of environmental justice, many who did so out of a spiritual tie and an embracing of our values, with the common slogan that water is sacred. A common bond was formed. But one of the things that came out of this, and this is something that I learned from one of the chiefs of the tribe that was directly involved one of the chiefs at Standing Rock. He was reporting to one of the national conferences that I was attending. And what he shared was that what became very clear is that there was a distinction between the non-native environmentalists and the aims of the tribal nation, and understanding what the fight was really all about. And for the tribal nation, it was about sovereign water rights. It was about a sacred relationship and their link to their identity with the land. They're linked to sacred areas and protecting ancestral remains. It was about treaty obligations and that the consultation process had been violated. All of these things were tribal concerns that were not necessarily what many of the non-native environmentalists seemed to have much of an understanding of. Even though they came and fought along with us, there was that difference. Our tie to the land is so important because our identity is part of the land. If you take a look at the chart on the right, we see that from 1492 to 1977, indigenous land holdings just were almost eradicated. Just a few dots are even visible on the map. And while there are some spaces elsewhere, they're so small they couldn't even register them there. And yet our ability to be tied to the land and be in harmony with our land and be in control of our people and our destiny and our land is tied to the community wellness, to our own health. And that involves negotiating tribal sovereignty with the sovereigns around us so that we can perpetuate our own tribal ways and our identity and not have it eradicated. Some of the things that have created a challenge can be summarized in what has contributed to a continuing legacy of trauma. Historical trauma is multi-generational. It is the experience by specific cultural, racial, or ethnic groups. It's related to major events of oppression, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and it is the result of many things. But one of the major factors for many of the populations is that it is a result of some form of genocide. And the United Nations definition of genocide is two-pronged. There's a mental element and a physical element to genocide. The mental element is an intent to destroy the national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And the physical element is actually physically killing or causing bodily harm, imposing measures to prevent birth, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And we have gone through all of that here in North America. The indigenous people of Turtle Island have suffered through all of that. US policy for many years was aimed at destroying our nations, of trying to integrate them, assimilate them, to steal the culture away. and to kind of make us into European Americans. And that hostility toward what was indigenous, while still actually kind of embracing it as an ideal, but attacking the people from which that ideal came, is called settler colonialism. And it's a genocidal policy that still we find in many of the federal laws and regulations and practices and policies right up to this day. Although they may not seem as overt, they are still perpetuating the damage. Within the last 2 centuries, there was the practice of the Indian boarding schools, where the slogan was "Kill the Indian and save the man." So to actually take all that was native from the culture out of that person, out of that child, and literally save them by turning them into Europeans. And that was called, the process of civilizing the Indians or Christianizing the Indians. And what's interesting is many of those that were forced into these schools were already Christian, and we had civilizations long before colonization. So, it was an insult to be treated in this fashion, and it caused wounds that went through generations. The photograph up to the upper left is of the graveyard at the Carlisle Indian School, where many Indian children are buried. And the memory of what happened there is not even well known right there in that community. The handcuffs are handcuffs that were used on children at the Haskell Indian School, and my relatives went there to Haskell. And those little handcuffs, as you can see, could not possibly fit on an adult. They were put on little, very young children to control them. The pain of that is evident, and it goes through generations because it taught children to be ashamed of who they actually were. Historical intergenerational trauma is compounded by this sense of invisibility within the modern culture. While America embraces this cowboy and Indian kind of image that comes to us out of a romanticized history, they have no real appreciation in a broad-based way of the truth of continuing American Indian culture and American Indian people. And this is emphasized by the fact that while there is a new focus on many injustices that have been perpetuated against many minorities, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, and certainly Black Lives Do Matter, one of the things that was completely overlooked is that Native people are more likely to be killed by police officers than any other minority group. And that was based on a study done by the National Institutes of Health. 4 out of 5 of our women are affected by violence. More than 10 times the murder rate, the national average murder rate, our women are murdered. And just as a major comparison, while I feel for her family, while I prayed that she was alive, the recent case of Gabby Petito, the young lady that was traveling with her boyfriend and wound up missing, and they found her body in Wyoming. And as of this morning, they were still looking for her boyfriend, who is, I don't know whether they're calling him a suspect, but it seems like he is. The national news focused on that. And it's not the first time that when, and excuse me, I don't mean to be offensive, but it's not the first time when a pretty blonde-haired white girl captured the news, and there were stories and shows, sometimes even for years afterwards. There's an absolute absence of the same kind of focus when women of other cultures, when people of other culture, other races, have similar acts perpetuated against them. 710 indigenous women went missing from Wyoming, and their disappearance drew little, if any, of the news reports or social media, while the national news focused on the Petito case and are still following that investigation. And very little is told of the suffering of American Indian women, even right there in the state where Gabby Petito's body was found. And the message that is received by our people, especially our children, is you don't matter. are people that were redefined and reclassified in the continuation of the impact of the triggers that cause this intergenerational trauma of, you don't matter, we're going to define you. Here you see in this photograph graduates of the Haskell Indian Institute, and they went to Haskell, and these are my relatives. They went to Haskell back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And then around 2000, suddenly they were ineligible because they weren't federally recognized Indians, even though many of the federally recognized Indians could not meet the requirement of Haskell when these individuals went, because their blood quantum met the requirement, but their state recognized Indians. Now they're ineligible to go. The lady on the left is my late cousin, and she wanted her grandchild to go to her alma mater, and she was going to take additional classes, and she was rejected because she was state recognized and not federally recognized, even though she was an alum and a member of the Alumni Association of the Haskell Indian Institute. This is the kind of thing that perpetuates that we define you, we're in control of you, and what you say you are does not matter. Historical trauma is lifespan long. It's imposed and moves from one generation to the next. It has not only an impact on the psyche, but it can impact physical health. And even those that did not experience it within their own lives, the oppression and the trauma, still can exhibit signs and symptoms of that trauma as depression, a fixation on the trauma, low self-esteem, anger, and self-destructive behavior. Indian children are at the highest risk of suicide among any minority group, any racial group in the United States. And for us, it's not merely historic. I add the word intergenerational because the traumatic experiences actually touch every generation. It's not just what's happening in the past, it's what happens even today. I have a personal testimony that actually I just started sharing this year. And this is something that happened to me way back in the early 90s, where I had a taste of the impact of intergenerational trauma, where I was very conscious of it. And looking back over various experiences in my life and my reactions and responses, I can see that there were elements of it, but this one stands out. I was part of a group that was studying the problems of the state of New Jersey, and we had gone up to Ellis Island and decided that we were going to be taken on a tour of Manhattan on a boat. And my colleagues were oohing and eyeing at the Manhattan skyline and looking at the buildings. And it's difficult to describe what happened to me, but something happened where I absolutely became extremely emotional. I had to move to another section of the boat. I was weeping uncontrollably. Every time I looked at the skyline of Manhattan, the only thing I could think was I couldn't see the land, that the land was covered. There were no trees. Concrete and buildings were everywhere. All I could think of was that the land was screaming, that it had been molested in some way, that the ancestors that were there were screaming. And, it's difficult. Anyone who knows me knows that that's not typically, how I respond to things. But I actually needed time to get myself together. And I sequestered myself from everyone else because I was weeping uncontrollably. And I couldn't understand what was happening to me. And I needed to be able to process it. And here, years later, I understand now that is part of Lenapehoking, and I have a tie to that land. And there was something deep within the DNA that was indeed feeling a loss and trauma from all that I was looking at. So, I'm not a person who suffers from clinical depression or anything like that, but there are many within our community that do and have it is worked itself out in symptoms of alcoholism and drug addiction and dysfunction and low self-esteem, poor achievement in many different ways based on the individual. Part of the process of overcoming stereotypes is by educating people that some of the things that they think are wrong and just stereotypes. One is that people don't receive automatic government checks. While there may be Indians that receive distribution or allotment, it's because the tribe itself has made money through some industry and it views its members as shareholders, or because of a treaty relationship and the fact that the tribe serves its people like a state would serve its citizens. It receives funds from the government just like the states do, and then the tribe just determines how to serve the citizens. But we just don't get checks that say this is your Indian check. That just doesn't happen, even though some Americans believe that it does. Most American Indians don't live on reservations. The vast majority, well over 75%, live out and about in cities and communities that are not tied to a reservation. And we live just like everybody else in houses and have jobs, and we're citizens of both the United States and our tribe. And one of the big things is that there is an assumption that all tribes either have or want casinos, and that's not the case. Most tribes don't have casinos, and of the tribes that don't, some don't even want them. Our tribe is one that actually has in its law that we can't profit from any form of vice because it's against our religious beliefs. What we wear are not called costumes. It's kind of offensive to call it a costume because a costume is something you wear to portray what you're not. You're pretending to be something else, whereas regalia is what you wear to express who you inherently are. And our culture is not stuck in the past. Just because our ancestors did something in one way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way. While we preserve many of the ways that they did things, we also are moving in and using various artistic media and singing traditions and everything else, just like every other culture evolves. So modern tribal art would utilize many of the modern elements and as any other culture, but would have that tribal flavor, but it would still be authentic because it's being done by tribal people and is tied to the history of that tribe. Some of the other things that contribute to trauma, in addition to stereotypes, disregard for our voice and our heritage when we actually own our heritage, and yet often we are treated like we don't. And what I mean by that is that there's a misappropriation of our culture, a misappropriation of many of our rituals, a utilizing it of these things without tribal permission. Some of them are sacred. Federal Indian policy perpetuates colonization. And one of the big issues is mascots, where you have people that will say they're honoring you, and when you tell them that it's insulting, they go from saying it's honoring of you to actually attacking you, sometimes physically, over that issue. Tribal sovereignty is the ability of a tribe to govern itself and its own affairs. And it is essential to us that we're able to do that. We're able to defend our rights because we are sovereigns, and we are inherently sovereign. It is not something that is given us by the United States, even though there are many American Indians, American Indian leaders who think that's the case. That is another form of the colonization that has taken hold of their minds. But tribal sovereignty is inherent. It was given by our creator. In fact, federal Indian policy acknowledges that prior to the establishment of the republic, our tribes already had sovereignty, and that the government at the state or federal level acknowledges that sovereignty, recognizes it, but does not establish it. Our people are staying together and promoting our sovereignty through the organizations we're a part of, through interaction with other sovereigns, with interaction with our fellow community members and those that we've had a relationship with for hundreds of years, like the community of Quakers in the Delaware Valley area. And we thank you for that continued partnership as we continue to survive and strive to thrive. in our homeland. Here are some links that can be used for any of you who are interested. I know that this is being recorded, so you'll be able to visit some of these sites at your leisure. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that was really informative. And it made me think a lot about our place in our culture today. Do you have time to answer some questions if people?
Absolutely.
Sandra Johnson, did you have a question?
Yes, I was curious, as a former Methodist, when it said something like Native American Church recognized by the United Methodist, whatever, I'm not sure exactly, but how did that, I'm curious about how that came about and what does that mean exactly? It's not a Methodist church, I assume.
Well, actually, yeah, the three tribal churches, matter of fact, all of the historic tribal churches are Methodist. The three that you saw in that photograph and their related congregations, some that had split off, are all Methodist churches. The Board of Global Ministries acknowledged it apparently, and I was not a part of it. I'm not a Methodist. I started out a Methodist many years ago, but I'm not a Methodist now. But the way I understand it, the local church produced and proved its history in each case to the district and the conference, which then sent that up to the Board of Global Ministries. And the United Methodist Church acknowledged these congregations as historic churches. And for the one in Bridgeton, that was just renewed, and they put money behind it. There was a news story about them providing an endowment for that congregation because of its history.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat. Someone asked, how much has the original culture and language survives today?
In regard to the culture, quite a bit. In regard to the language, there aren't a lot of born speakers anymore, but there are more today than there were 25 years ago. The last of the born speakers that grew up speaking it and their parents spoke and everything, they were out in Oklahoma and up in Canada, and one of them gathered a few others together. Dean Thompson gathered a few together in Oklahoma to revive the Unami dialect, and she worked very hard on that in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and actually visited our community also. The tribes have the vocabulary and grammar well preserved, interestingly enough, by missionaries who documented a lot of it. And so between the living speakers from that generation and the grammar and the vocabulary that was well documented, there's a revival of the dialects of the Munsee and Unami dialect of Lenape. Another dialect that was a kind of a subdialect of Unami is called Unalactico. That it really has kind of been lost. There's an older dialect called Northern Unami that is preserved, but it's not spoken. And Nanticoke is being revived. About several hundred words of the language were preserved, interestingly enough, on a commission by Thomas Jefferson when he was president. And they wound up, there's a book that's even available today, The Vocabulary of the Nanticoke. And our sister tribe has been working with linguists because it's tied to Lenape and the other Algonquian dialects. Somehow experts in language research can derive the Nanticoke form of many of the words that are common throughout the Algonquian dialects. So that's being revived also. Our children are better at it than those of us who have gray hair right now.
I grew up in Oklahoma with the Kickapoo Indians. My folks' parents worked for the Friends United Meeting with them. I always kind of was uncomfortable when people would say they were missionaries. Both of them had training as social workers, and I felt it was more in that reference. But I have to say, I kind of feel like I absorbed a lot of that. I couldn't tell you how, but I've attended so many of the dances and the festivals and visited in wigwams and so on. But I was so young, I didn't know the questions to ask, and my parents are long gone. But I feel a real connection. I would love to have some of my ashes spread over the hillside. My family, a lot of my parents and sister are buried there now. But my question to you would be: you talked about when the back in the 1700s, I think it was the Fenwicks that kind of connected with the with your people. How did it go from there? What was their relationship after their connection?
Well, John Fenwick's, there are a lot of stories about how it went. And I what I can say is it went better than most areas.
Which isn't a high bar.
Yeah, it's not a high bar, but considering the fact that we're still here in southern New Jersey,
yeah,
it's because of the Quaker community in that area around Salem County and Cumberland County that we were able to stay. And our chief absolutely affirms that. He talks about how Quakers bought land because we weren't allowed to, and then would wind up deeding it over to the families. They would kind of be an intermediary, and that the area called Indian Fields was set aside for our people to live in. It wasn't an official reservation because it wasn't established by the state, but locally it was a known area that was set aside for our people, and the families are still there today, to this very day. So while it may not have been ideal, and while if it was us today, we probably could do a better job because we've learned from the mistakes of the past. In comparison, it was a blessing because we were able to live in friendship, even though there was misunderstanding and cultural conflict and everything. We were able to live in relative peace. We did not fight there's no history of having any fighting with the Quakers among my people. There's no memory of that, and we do have a memory of fighting with some others. And the interesting thing was when Penn came, there was a conflict between Penn and Fenwick. And from what I've been able to gather, and this is just my assumption, it seems as though our ancestors were mighty confused by that because they both were British and they both were Quakers. But there was a struggle, some sort of a power struggle for a while between the two. But Penn also reached out to our people, seemed to understand that he needed to meet us on a level playing field, learned our language. I mean, there were some shortcomings there because while he wanted to live together in peace, he wanted to live together in peace under the British crown. But in regard to how it went elsewhere, this area experienced a much better situation than many did. Those of us around the Bay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Someone's raising their hand.
Go ahead, Sue.
I'm on several racial justice committees within my meeting and the yearly meeting. Where would our energies be most useful to support Native American needs, rights, wishes, reparations, who knows?
Well, I think, based on the region that you're in, it's going to differ. Nationally, there are some causes and issues, and the National Congress of American Indians can speak to that. They have published their goals and agenda every year on their website. Regionally, though, part of the issue for our tribes here in the Delaware Valley area, around the bay and the southern part of the Delaware River, is the relationship with the states, to continue to reaffirm that. In New Jersey, we need to have a form of the Native American Graves and Protection Act. We need to have a form of the Indian Child Welfare Act, both in New Jersey and in Delaware, because those federal protections do not apply to tribes that are not on the Bureau of Indian Affairs list of federal tribes. So the federal tribes get those protections and our children don't. Every time one of our children is taken from a tribal family, instead of contacting the tribe to see if a tribal family will take them in, relatives will take them in, often they can be placed elsewhere. And if a judge is not sensitive to these issues, they will treat us like we have no rights over that child. So that's something that's important. Working and pushing for the educational curricula in the states to tell the truth, that we are still here, to communicate with us in regard to the telling of our history, which, we're the ones that can tell our story. And I think it's important that that be part of the curricula. I think, and some of the schools are talking about it, although it hasn't happened. There are schools in New Jersey that are on lands that were taken from our people. And part of the agreement was that they were going to educate our children. And yet our kids, even if they're accepted, and I think, they should have to go through whatever process and earn the right to be accepted just like anyone else. But because of that relationship, because of that history, there should be some scholarship money tied to the children who are citizens of tribes of this state, because the universities are operating on our traditional lands. So those are some of the issues about Indian rights that still are quite important. And the Commission on American Indian Affairs in the state of New Jersey, Steve Burton is the new chairman. He's someone that you might be able to coordinate with. But those are the kinds of things, and making people aware of it, telling the story that we're still here, and sharing some of the things that I shared today.
I heard everything that you said, and my brain is not retaining all of that. Is there a way that you could somehow, I get that it has to be state rather than federal, because the federal doesn't protect the same rights that federal would if you guys were recognized by the federal government. But you I think you had 4 different points. The child thing was one, but I don't know the names of it. Is there any way that there could be a cheat sheet for us?
Yeah,
at some point?
Absolutely. But I can, if I start writing in the chat, I won't be able to answer the questions.
No,
but
give it to Josh.
Okay.
Email it to Josh, if that's okay with you, Josh.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and Sandra knows this. My memory is not that good. If someone can prompt me as to what I'm supposed to do after this, give me a to-do list, I'll make sure that I fulfill those promises.
I thank you.
No problem. The other thing that I would say for us is that our tribe is interested in gaining federal recognition. The records that we have are extensive, but in many ways, they're not as detailed. We don't have a treaty per se that lists our people. We weren't enumerated in the allotments in the early 1900s because we weren't out west on a reservation. And so the advocacy of the local communities, especially organizations that have been in relationship with us intergenerationally, affirming who we are and standing up for us and saying to the powers that be that they deserve it, is a great help. The 2 ways that we can gain acknowledgement is through the federal acknowledgement process, which is broken, but we're still trying, or Congress can do it. For the tribes in Virginia, there were 5 tribes that were recognized within the past 4 or 5 years by an act of Congress. And it was because Congress realized that they had been, administratively reclassified and everything through history. So if we could get the politicians to support it at the federal level and to push for a bill that we've already written that eliminates the possibility of casino gaming or anything like that, just gives us our federal status, that would be helpful. And I understand the federal government is afraid of Quakers, so that would really be a great ally to have.
They respect us. That's the positive spin.
We're the force in the country. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, which maybe it's just my ignorance or I didn't understand. Where do people live? If you're a member of a tribe, does that indicate that you live close to people of the tribe, or do most people just live out in the community and you get together in the community center when there's something? So
That's a fair question.
Okay.
For tribes that are large land-based tribes that have large reservations, and there are some state reservations that still exist. Some of them have come down from the colonial era. There are a few up in New York. Usually it's in the Northeast or the South. It's on the tribes of first contact, like my own, that had lands that wound up not being taken from them like ours was. So in many of those instances, there is a cluster of people that will actually live on tribal land. In instances where there's no reservation, but there are the core of the community, many of the families will still live in the traditional area. And the one example is my own. Most of our population is still around the bay, with a heavy, the dominant portion still being in Cumberland and Salem County. Now, I don't live in Cumberland County. I live in Burlington County. I live in Moorestown, New Jersey. I grew up here. And there are members of our tribe that are, matter of fact, I was in communication with one that was living in the mountains of Wales, British Isles. So, and was a citizen of our tribe. So, we have moved out and moved about just like any other population would, but there's still concentrations around the traditional territory, whether it be a reservation, out west for a different tribe, like I think the Kickapoo was the tribe that was mentioned earlier. There's a reservation, there'd be a concentration of the population there or not. But one of the things that I like to stress is most American Indians don't live on reservations anymore. Most just live out in the community. You may be surprised at who's down the street from where you live.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As the culture of our country changes, are you more apprehensive, or is there some hope for your culture?
I think that there, at least what I've seen is there's a great interest in learning the truth among people like yourselves. But the sad thing is, among people like yourselves, you've always been interested in maintaining relationship and justice issues and everything like that. I think, like many Americans, I'm looking at our country, and I'm in deep prayer over the divisions, over the lack of vision, over the inability to listen. The extremes, we're big at pointing at each other and saying you're the problem, without realizing that it's the pointing at each other and saying you're the problem that is the problem, and that we're not listening to one another and pulling together. In the recent commemoration of 9/11, I remember how no one was divided along political lines or racial lines in the wake of that. We were mourning together and supporting one another. And there was this sense of community with people that didn't look like you, didn't live where you lived, didn't even talk like you. That's gone. And that has nothing to do with me being an American Indian. That's just about me being an American. And I find that so sad. That it took that level of tragedy to give us just a moment of that level of unity that has continued to deteriorate over the years, especially over the last 4. But I have hope, because every time there's anything that's positive happens in history, it's because of some remnant of people like yourselves who are still committed to doing the right thing. even if you're pessimistic about what impact it'll have, there's a feeling that at least I've got to do my part. And the more that there are people like that, the more we can have those moments of unity.
Can you talk a little bit about, or maybe you did and I missed it, the church where you are now?
Oh, absolutely.
In Ewing, right?
Yes, yes. The congregation I pastor now is not a tribal congregation. It is an urban congregation simply because it's near the city, but it's mixed in regard to its cultural and ethnic background. And it was established in 1992 as an outgrowth of a church that I was pastoring. We had an outreach to the local youth and whose families weren't attached to a Methodist church that I was pastoring at the time. And the youth of that community that we started ministering to, and my wife is like the mother to everybody. So I was living in the parsonage and I'd go downstairs and there'd be all these kids eating breakfast and, then knocking on the door and coming in, and, she was just everybody's mother. And that started a youth ministry that didn't have a name. And it was an independent youth ministry. And we asked the kids what they wanted to name it. And they came up with the word Ujima, which is actually a Kiswahili word, which is one of the non-tribal languages in Eastern Africa, and that united many people. And the word means the collective life of a community, assuming responsibility for one another, working together. And we said, okay, that's great. That little youth ministry turned into a congregation that I wound up pastoring. And today we are in Ewing Township, and we've done housing projects. We've had training for people that were in need of jobs. We've had outreach to the homeless, and we are a Christian worshiping community to this day. And anytime you want to visit, you're welcome.
Sandra and Jim, are you going to have a question?
I do.
You look like
Do
it.
we have time for me to put it out there?
Yes, absolutely.
Pastor, before Attorney General Graywall was able to reach resolution with the tribal nation and have the reaffirmation of tribal status, we were somewhat asked to be quiet and not to disturb the waters where there would be misunderstandings that continued. With some of the pieces that you mentioned where it would be helpful for tribal nation to address and speak up. There's also the wondering that wasn't exactly named, but we did hear from the New Jersey Historical Commission on September 15th, where literally we heard from a Ramapo-Lenape member of the Commission on Indian Affairs, right? And so there's motivation then to ask our schools that have harmful mascotry, logos, chants that seem to be around high school and some middle school, usually identities. 77 New Jersey high schools were in the list of harmful namings. And so it seems that there's an interest in moving that forward now, somewhat safely, but then there's always that treading on water where we don't know where it could be twisted and become unsafe. And so for any of the initiatives, those that you mentioned and this one that I'm raising now, are there things that you would be able to identify that we should be more mindful of that could turn something to be less than progressive in an innocent perspective?
I think all of the issues that I raised and the one you just raised about the 77 schools in the state are issues that need to be addressed. And it's best addressed in cooperation with allies. The issue, and I've been asked this before by some other folks that were activists. And what I always say is never get ahead of the tribe. That what you want to do is find out what fight the tribe, the local tribe. Let's say you have some of the schools that are near the Ramapo, for example. Well, you wouldn't want to go in there if that's not the priority of Ramapo, because they're going to immediately turn to them and drag them into the fight, even if that's not their chief concern at the time. So you always want to coordinate with the local tribal community. And that coordination could just simply be, look, we're about to raise a stink because we think this is racist. Do you mind, because this is your area? And if they don't mind, even if they say, it's not our top priority, but we'll give you letters of support, then you have a blessing. But you never want to put the tribe in a position where, let's say, they may be negotiating with the county commissioners on something, or the school board on curricula. And if you come in with your agenda, what they've done could be completely smashed in regard to relationship. So you always want to coordinate with the people that are going to be affected by what you're doing. Once that's done, have at it. I really think that we're in a much better position now, having won the fight with the state. We're looking at, how we go about things always has to be strategic, because we're always negotiating in one way or another for different things. But absolutely, once you coordinate, and see, is this okay? We want to fight this battle. And the tribe knows that, they can say you're fighting it. Individuals in the tribe that want to get with you, great. Maybe the tribe will be right there with you, or maybe its agenda is a little different, but at least they're aware of what you're doing, and you've blessed, and they've given you the blessing.
How do you know who to contact? Like you're in Morristown and I'm in Lumberton. So we're looking at Lenape, Shawnee, etc.
Right. Well, the tribes that would be closest to our area would be the Powhatan Lenape, and sadly, they just lost their leader. The Reverend Bundy passed away in July. They're reorganizing in regard to that, but they do have commissioners that sit on the New Jersey Commission of Indian Affairs. So if you don't know how to contact the tribe, you can always contact the commission and ask, what tribe is in this area that has a seat on the commission, and coordinate with them. What you don't want to do is go to anyone that says, this is my territory and I'm the chief, because you don't know if they're really a tribe.
Right.
And right now, the ones that I had mapped out in the presentation are the tribes in New Jersey. There are 3 state recognized tribes and 1 other that we acknowledge as historic, and that's it. I've heard of some down in Absecon or something like that, and I have no idea who they are. You get these little historic groups that just pop up out of nowhere, and they start, claiming names, and they're not historic communities. But in New Jersey, you do have those.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, and I put in the chat, the email address that I carry for the Salem Quarter Indian Affairs Committee, as well as Philadelphia Yearly Meetings First Contact Reconciliation Collaborative. That is not to say that I am the only PAC. It's not to say that I am the most knowledgeable PAC, but it is to say that I do maintain active relationship and can weave information through different points of our communities. So just for us to stay in contact with one another, it's always good to know who's doing what, where, and if there are advices that we need to share. And some of that work is already taking place across collaboratives within Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, as well as across yearly meetings where we have a joint committee on Indian Affairs.
Well, if there are no further comments or questions, can we please thank the pastor for his time? Yay. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming out, and yeah, maybe we'll be able to meet in person one day.
Always a pleasure. I say wanishi, which is thank you, and we don't have a word for goodbye, but we do. The way we do bless one another as we depart is to say, I will see you again, which is Lapich Kanewu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We begin by acknowledging the land where we're sitting, gathered virtually today, land of all of our Tri-Quarter Friends meeting houses, land where we've been planning today's gathering for renewal. We are on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni-Lenape, land known as Lenape-Hoking. This peninsula is specifically known as Shackamaxon. For some who might be more virtually afar, let us honor too the ancient ones of your region who similarly may hold sacred relationships with place. Let us remember that we are occupying the traditional territory of Lenape people here more than 12,000 years. Consider that, what 12,000 years might feel like. A time long before the Great Pyramids, longer before Jesus. Maybe 600 generations or longer. 600 generations or longer. Here, Lenape cultural lifeways thrive. Language, ceremonies, food, provisions, all from this land. Lenape live in relationship with this land. Colonization and dismissive policies by predominant culture were causative of Lenape deaths and removals, yet some Lenape tribal nations remain in Lenape-Hoking, and Lenape Nation citizens continue to live in regions now known as New Jersey and Delaware. These keepers of the land are our sovereign friends. Ramapo Lenape, Powhatan Lenape, Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape, Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware. Lenape tribal nations and citizens, neighbors, no longer hiding in plain sight, but celebrating and revitalizing Lenape ways. We witness ceremonies, spirituality, hospitality, friendship, and peace. Together, may our lives be opening to budding, contemporary, right relationships. Let it be so. Amen. And Pastor, in the tradition of Tri-Quarter, we often have the release of butterflies, and we know that the milkweed is important to them on their long migrations. And so if those will serve you and your community somewhere, someplace, you will receive a pod of milkweeds. We also have marigold seeds, and in this case, they are orange, and the significance of the orange in remembering the Indian boarding school children and bringing them home. And lastly, we have drying sage. We have rosemary for memory. And we have ceremonial tobacco seeds for ancient seeds from the Seneca Nation that are drying in this little pot. And we gift them to you if it is of your will.